That's so welcome. Welcome, everybody, to this first Humanistic Leadership Academy webinar for our fall series. We're excited to have Dr. David Sloan Wilson join us. I am Brian Wellinghoff. I'm a member of the Barry Waymiller organization. We're a partner to HLA. I'm also a co-founder of HLA, and we'll be giving the fourth webinar in our webinar series. But absolutely excited to have Dr. David Sloan Wilson with us today. You see the agenda. He'll be sharing some insights. We'll have a breakout group opportunity to dive into those in more depth, and that'll lead to some additional insights and dialogue with plenty of time for Q&A along the way. One of the key items is please feel free to utilize that chat at any point to make comments and questions. Really want this to be an interactive session in a variety of different ways, and we're excited and thankful that all of you could join us this morning. Just be mindful, we do have 3 additional webinar sessions coming up in successive weeks here, and we hope that you can join them all along the way. With that, it's my distinct honor to introduce Michael Pearson, who is a founder of the Humanistic Leadership Academy and sort of a foremost author and thought leader in this area, who's going to introduce our speaker today. So I'm going to pull that slide down and turn it over to Michael. Michael, would you please introduce today's speaker?
Yes, well, wonderful. Thank you, Brian. And thank you all for being here. As Brian said, we're extremely excited to have this fall webinar series start. And David Sloan Wilson is, I think, one of the most prominent evolutionary biologists. If there is somebody that's making progress and advancing our understanding of who we are as human beings through the lens of the study of life, which is biology, I think it is really David who has been doing that. There may be 2 other Wilsons, and it seems like you need to have the last name Wilson, E.O. Wilson, or there's, I think, another Wilson called Richard Wilson, right? David, you might correct me, but there seems to be some kind of connection in the study of evolutionary biology and really advancing our fundamental understanding of how we have survived as a species. And I have to say that it's a fantastic honor to have you here with us, David. Mm-hmm. And I have learned so much from you and from your books. And I know that you are not only a scholar, but you're turning activist and leader in this field of pro-sociality. And maybe you'll share with us a little bit about your journey, but also how you think we can actually transform our organizations, our relationships, our world through the insights that evolutionary biology and evolution has provided to us. So I will stop here. I just want to say how excited I am. And I do think that the big opportunity here is for us to change paradigms and not just work off the cuffs and with some kind of lived experience, but really have the conceptual and theoretical foundations that we used, which basically come from economics, be replaced by much more scientific and tested knowledge that gives us much more accurate understanding of who we are as human beings than what we have had prior to work with. So this is a huge opportunity, I think. And David, you have been at the forefront of this, so I'll turn over to you. Thank you again for being here with us. And yeah, looking forward to an exciting conversation.
Well, thank you, everyone, Michael and Brian, and quite a few friends here on this call that I know, including Ron and Dwight. And I've been interacting with you, Michael, for quite a long time. I am attempting to function as a practitioner in addition to a theorist. And on the practitioner end, I'm the one who's the learner, and you are the ones who are the experts. And so this is very much of a two-way street, as I think you'll see from my talk. So let's launch in. And starting with that word paradigm, we use it all the time, but we really should reflect upon what a paradigm is. It's an internally stable configuration of ideas that has difficulty escaping its own assumptions. And it has an intriguing similarity to the concept of basins of attraction in complex systems science. If you're a complex systems thinker, then you know about that term. And neoclassical economics, which we all know, I don't need to tell you about that, has been the dominant paradigm in business education since World War II. And represented by good old Milton Friedman here in the shareholder value model, and widely regarded, I think, especially by the people on this call, as a source of the problems facing the world today. And I don't have to say much more about that because I think that's all the shared experiences of the people on this call. So when we ask what is opposing the neoclassical paradigm, I think I love this quote from Jeffrey Hodgson, someone who I suspect is quite well known, again, to this audience, who in an interview said, lots and lots of change going on, very impressive innovation, but the core actually just soldiers on ahead, that core, that paradigm. And so what we have, I agree with Jeffrey, is we have many heterodox schools of thought. That's great, but they do not really cohere with each other. And so what they form is what I call diffuse pluralism. Good that is pluralistic, bad that is diffuse. And what we need is a new alternative paradigm, a configuration of ideas that actually hangs together in the same way as the neoclassical configuration does. And this is what my colleague Dennis Snower and I are providing in a series of articles titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Economics. That builds upon an article that I wrote with one of the other Wilsons, Edward O. Wilson, titled Rethinking the Theoretical Foundation of Sociobiology in 2007. And this article, or series, has been actually widely circulated in draft form for almost 2 years and was the subject of an Evonomics.com article conversation between us a good year ago. Part one will soon be published in an online journal, Economics, in a new section that Dennis and I are creating called Economics as an Evolutionary Science. And so my point here is that Dennis and I are working with many others, Michael and many others, are really attempting some field building and some catalysis here so that not only is there a paradigm shift, but there's a paradigm shift now. And if that sounds unrealistic, it's not. So I think that if you just try to think of it as within the realm of possibility, that we could have a paradigm shift in years, not decades, or not at all, and to become involved in what we're trying to accomplish. And so we call the new paradigm the multi-level paradigm, and it can be explained in 4 key words listed here. And I'm going to zip through the 4 key words in reverse order. So beginning with evolution, Jeffrey Hodgson does a great job of explaining how this word has always had a very broad sense of meanings from the very beginning all the way up to the present. If you say the word evolution, actually you could be meaning a whole bunch of things. Darwin gave the word a very specific meaning, which is a process that includes the 3 ingredients of variation. Organisms vary in just about everything that could be measured. Selection, those differences make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction. And replication, traits tend to be passed on through the generations. That's what a Darwinian process is. And so the new paradigm is based specifically on Darwinian evolution, not evolution in any broader sense. So cultural means that there's more evolution than genetic evolution. One of the problems here is that although Darwin thought broadly about evolution, knowing nothing about genes, with the advent of genetics, the study of evolution became narrowly focused on genetic evolution, as if the only way that offspring can resemble parents is by sharing the same genes. And so what we've done is we've gone back to basics and defined Darwinian evolution as any process that includes these 3 ingredients, no matter what the physical mechanism. Therefore, that means human cultural evolution and individuals as open-ended evolutionary processes, what B.F. Skinner calls selection by consequences. And so, of course, this expansion of Darwinian evolution beyond genetic evolution is what makes it so very relevant to everything going on around us, everything cultural, therefore everything business. So that's called generalized Darwinism. Multi-level captures this fundamental dynamic that if we consider anything pro-social, anything oriented towards the welfare of others or our groups as a whole, are inherently vulnerable to more self-serving behaviors. And that's captured by the sentence, selfishness beats altruism within groups. This is why altruism and other forms of pro-sociality is not more widespread, because it's dangerous to be pro-social. We can be taken advantage of if we're pro-social. And so the advantage of pro-sociality resides at a slightly larger scale, captured by the sentence altruistic group beats selfish groups. So that captures this very fundamental dynamic, which can be stretched out to multiple levels of a multi-level hierarchy of social units. And so I like to say that multi-level selection is like a perverse alchemist who turns gold into lead. So virtue turns into vice. So self-preservation can easily lead to self-dealing. Helping kith and kin can easily lead to cronyism and nepotism. My corporation first can lead to extreme inequality. My nation's first can lead to international conflict. Growing economies can lead to overheating the earth. So it's humbling to think that nearly every social pathology, especially at a large scale, is actually a form of virtue at a smaller scale. And the dynamic of multi-level selection is that we need to everything we do has to reflect this dynamic. And so what that means is that the neoclassical paradigm's root metaphor of the invisible hand, the idea that we can pursue our lower level interests, and that somehow works out as if led by an invisible hand for the common good, it's just untrue. It's just not correct at a very fundamental level. And so this is why you begin to see the paradigmatic nature of all of this. And so because of this multi-level dynamic, that means that we must be conscious about our change efforts. A rapid cultural evolution is taking place whether we want it or not. And if we don't manage it, it basically results in lower level adaptations that have become disruptive up the scale. And so we must basically make the welfare of whole systems the target of selection. We must orient variation around the target. We must be conscious basically about all three ingredients of a Darwinian process: selection, variation, and replication. And then we must repeat that again and again and again. Nobody is smart enough to know the right answer. And so therefore we must be experimental. We must be basically churning through cycles of variation, selection, and replication at all scales and all contexts. So a huge part of this is based on the work of Elinor Ostrom. And I don't see you gallery here because I'm screen sharing here, but love to know how many people on this call are familiar with Elinor Ostrom. I'm betting it's a pretty high proportion, and I'm betting it's not 100%. So Elinor Ostrom was a political scientist who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009, but she was not an economist. And in fact, she was the biggest outlier that ever won the Nobel Prize in economics. She studied the famous tragedy of the commons, the tendency of groups to overexploit their resources. And what she showed was by studying common pool resource groups around the world, that actually some of them were able to avoid the tragedy of the commons. They were able to self-manage their resources if they implemented certain core design principles. And it's very important to say that these groups that she studied, they varied in their ability to avoid the tragedy of the commons. Some of them succumbed. It was only some that were able to self-manage their resources. And it was thanks to that variation that Ostrom was able to derive the core design principles. And I collaborated with Lynn, as she encouraged everyone to call her, for 3 years prior to her death. And what we did together was we generalized the core design principles from an evolutionary perspective. And we showed that they're actually needed not only by common pool resource groups, but by all groups, for all cooperative endeavors. And so this is a generalized wording of the core design principles. And what I want you to do is I want you to think of a workplace that you know well, some workplace that you know well, And then I'll zip through these core design principles and just see how well this group that you know well has implemented the core design principles, and also how well it functioned as a group. And then we're going to break into this breakout groups so that you can share your experience. And so the groups that work well, I claim, number one, have a clear sense of identity and sense of purpose. They know that they're a group, the group is doing meaningful work, they know who is a member, so on and so forth. Strong sense of shared identity and purpose. There's an equitable distribution of benefits and resources, not sustainable for some members of the group to get most of the benefits and other members to do most of the work. And decision-making, fair and inclusive, not sustainable for some members of the group to make the decisions that just get imposed on other members of the group. Transparency of behaviors. We need to know whether or not we're doing what we should. We need to monitor our agreed upon behaviors in a way that's not exploitative or invasive, but we just need to know if we're doing what we've agreed upon to do. Graduated responding to one helpful behavior. If we're performing well, it should be rewarded. If we're not performing well, it should be corrected. But the correction can be friendly and mild at first and only escalate when necessary. So fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur. They need to be resolved as quickly as possible and in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. In a dispute, most sides think that they have a point of view. Autonomy and authority to self-govern, basically. You have to have elbow room. A group must have elbow room to implement these core design principles. If not, if they're being bossed around from the outside, then all bets are off. And then finally, appropriate relations with other groups, which reflect the same core design principles. So what this means is that the core design principles are scale independent. They are needed for relations among groups, no less than within groups. And so there's a tremendous generality to these principles, all scales, all contexts. And so with that, I think if you just pause a minute, think about these principles in relation to your group and how well your group functions. The three questions that we ask when we introduce these principles are, in the first place, do you understand them? In the second place, do you think they might be important for your group? And in the third place, how well does your group implement them? And if you think there's something important that's not on the list, we call that auxiliary design principles, and they're important too. So this is the core set that's needed for cooperation in all their forms, but there's additional principles that are needed by some groups, but not others. And so with that, Brian, if you can form us into breakout rooms, I'm happy to join one of them. And then we'll have a discussion about these, and then we'll return.
Welcome, everybody. We're bringing you back. So this is a chance to remute your phones. Everybody will be joining back within the next 30 seconds or so. Please, if you're interested in sharing an update for your breakout group, just raise your hand within Zoom, and we'll get to a variety of different groups along the way based on the questions that David Sloan Wilson gave us. So welcome back. So many different people. It'll be just about 10 more seconds until everybody gets back in the main room. And if you can, I'm monitoring the list of participants. You can use a little raise your hand icon if you'd like to share something on behalf of your group. We hope it was a chance to meet a variety of different people, like-minded people on the call. I know always there can be some small tech issues and different things along the way. But if it's all right, David, since you joined one of the groups, David, if you wouldn't mind just leading us off a little bit, and then I'll ask others to raise your hand remotely, and we'll get some comments as you reflected on those questions that David gave us. What were some of the key things that came out? David, what was the conversation like in your breakout group?
Well, we talked a little bit about business school groups. And so that was entertaining. And I think a point I actually didn't make there because I didn't have time is that university groups, I think, often do score quite poorly on the core design principles. They're intrinsically autocratic and capricious in terms of decisions made and all of that sort of stuff. But I think that my group mates more or less agreed that on those three questions, do you understand them? They're simple to understand. Y'all understood it. I'm pretty sure of that. Are they important? I'm betting that you'd agree that they were, but how well implemented? Well, maybe. And Robert from my group made the point that in some groups, there's such an alignment of interest that it seems like conflicts are not going to arise, or they don't arise very often. Mm-hmm. And my response to that was, you still want the mechanism in place, because you never can tell when a conflict is going to arise. And so you're leaving yourself vulnerable, even in a group that's highly aligned. Nice to have something, on call for in case a conflict does arise. I see that, James, would you like to?
Yeah, we've got some hands going. Jim Stoner, please go next.
I love the questions, and I applied them to the team I work with called Global Movement Initiative, of which there's, I think, 4 of us on this call, and I'm eager to share with them, get their impressions of it. I think we look great. But I also looked at 3 places I worked: MIT, Fordham, and Columbia University. And it was fun to kind of run through in my mind those 3 categories. And Icy is on this call from Fordham. We were both at Fordham. I was there at one stage. I'm retired. And I'm eager to see if they might apply these criteria to the various faculty breakout areas, faculty sections, finance, marketing, etc., all of which have groups. So I love the questions. Thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. We'll come to Ravi. Ravi, what would you like to share from your group?
Yeah, our group had a very interesting discussion on India, a country I come from, and one of our 3 members is actually working in India, so he gave some insights. And what we found was socialization of costs and privatization of profits. The elite are really grabbing a lot of money for themselves, and income skewness is on the increase. And the real problem is they're taking that net profit out of the country. So the public commons is really going out of the country, and when in fact it should stay inside the country. So that's the basic problem there. But the 3rd member, who is in Hyderabad, can give you more insights. He had a lot of good things to share with us.
I think that really reveals the multi-level nature of this, all the way up to national governance and international governance and all of this. And there's many problems that cannot be solved at a small scale. They must be solved at a large scale. For the time being, there are obstacles that must be worked around. And there's a whole piece on flexibility, by the way, that I couldn't get to for lack of time. But in addition to having governance rules, it's also important to be flexible, adaptable. And that's another thing where both individuals and groups vary. Some do it on their own, others don't. And it is coachable. All of these things are coachable.
Oh, wonderful. Christiane, why don't you go next?
Hi, good morning, everyone. So we discussed a little bit about the principle number 1, the identity. And I brought up a little bit about what if the identity of the group makes them feel superior to others? Couldn't that maybe lead to bad behaviors that, somehow may damage others? And it could be also the glue that brings the group together, even though the other principles are not really at their best. And I think Kimberly also wants to add a little bit to that. She's next. Thank you.
Yeah, so why don't we take that comment from, I believe you said Kimberly, and then we'll get David's response. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So that was great. I didn't know Christina was going to come on and do such a great synopsis. Yeah, I think we had 2 pieces to that. So, if identity becomes too strong, particularly when it becomes superior, does that allow for paradigms to shift? Because, it's kind of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So that's a danger in that. And I think just the other part we didn't get to, but I'd love to throw into this conversation, was on the variation, selection, and replication. The addition under selection of the word implementation, because I think a lot of this, we're a lot of academics on this as well. And the idea is that we have to kind of get whatever it is that we're doing into something real, something built. That would be an important part for me to see how we're going to make a big change. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. David, a couple of thoughts there. How would you like to respond?
Oh, I just do. I think that touched upon this perverse alchemist dynamic that when a group functions well, that's great, but how does it relate to other groups? And so that can be harmful up the scale. And I think there's many cases where, because the neoclassical paradigm just kind of celebrates competition in all its forms, and so that very often there's competitions which are established within companies that are end up destructive. I mean, Eddie Lampert at Sears, and there's quite a few famous examples of competition that's destructive. So teams of various sorts are working well, but they're operating at cross purposes with each other, and so that brings in the eighth core design principles: appropriate relations with other groups.
David, would you mind applying that a little bit to the various groups that are represented here? The pro-social movement that you lead, Humanistic Leadership Academy, International Humanistic Management. There's a lot of groups looking to do good in the world. Your thoughts on competition amongst those groups, collaboration, and that final design principle of how you be in right relationship with other groups, attempting to change the paradigm.
Well, this crowd is pro-social through and through. And so not only do they want their groups to function well, but they want their groups to be doing no harm up the scale. A point I want to make is that, it's easy to think about like cooperators and cheaters, and that if a group isn't functioning well, there's, like a self-serving person in it or something like that. But in my experience, in many groups, everyone is well-meaning, and still they fail. And so I think that's and often they're so passionate about getting their way, that there's especially if it's a founder, and you're all experienced with groups, and so I think that's I think gives some sympathy for this. But I need to get back to my slides, so let's have Dave provide his comment, and then and there'll be additional room for Q&A, but I'd like to zip through the rest of my slides.
Beautiful. Yeah, Dov, let's go to you, and then David will get back to his slide presentation.
Awesome. So when I was in my room with Isabel, we were looking at our groups, and we were looking at how, you could pretty much go through the core practices and kind of check them all off. And then she'd mentioned that in one of her groups, at the end of the meeting, there was always this reflection time. And it's, I think in that reflection time, we get to look at, what works and what doesn't work. And that becomes a practice. So at the end of every meeting, it becomes a practice, which you mentioned at the beginning of what you shared is that you are in a practice. And so the practice could be looking at these core design principles over and over again, not going through it as a checklist. Okay, we're all good to go, and let's move on to the next. But the practice of reflecting on those core design principles, how effective are they being? And then the direct connection with that practice to performance. Look at the difference that we're making in the world. So always looking back as the practice of fulfilling on our goals. So
yeah, that's great, and it does bring in the flexibility piece. When we talk about mindfulness practices, we are talking about flexibility and adaptiveness with meetings just like that. And so we could go on. How do we structure a meeting? In fact, Ted Rao, who's one of the leaders of the sociocracy movement, has a wonderful essay called "The Tragedy of the Meeting." And if you just focus on a single meeting and think about the core design principles and how that might work well or poorly, and sociocracy provides some very good examples of decision-making algorithms and so on, which are very efficient, and they're inclusive without being inefficient, because consensus decision-making, as we all know, can become inefficient. But how meetings are run, how you check in, whether you have like moment of silence or centering exercises, a little bit of time just to chat, as before you get down to business, is actually an efficient use of time. And all of that. So I think that, and I think many people have converged upon this, and so they're doing it without needing to be taught. And I'll be making that point again in my slides. So maybe I'll return to my slides. Is that okay, Brian?
That
Can
sounds
I
excellent.
let me just respond to what you were sharing. What comes up for me is the work that we do at HLA is ontological in its nature. It's a way of being. So what runs in the background is reflecting on your core design principles. That inquiry is always running in the background. And so as and when it shows up, it's like, oh, there's this one, and there's that one. So
Yeah.
I was just connecting the two.
Yeah. I think that, I have a slide for you coming up.
Excellent. Share away.
Beautiful. So David, why don't you launch those slides? I see the chat is starting to get busy too. Continue to put those questions in the chat. And after David shares a few more slides, then we'll have some ability for more comments and questions.
Okay. Well, we did a study along these lines where it's a survey study where we asked the participants to bring two groups to mind, a workplace group and any other group of their choice. And then they provided information about how well the groups implemented the core design principles and how well they functioned as groups with respect to trust, satisfaction, needs, cooperation, and commitment. And the results were a strong correlation between the implementation of the CDPs and performance outcomes for all kinds of groups. So in other words, workplace groups need these core design principles just as much as any other kind of groups. But on average, workplace groups were deficient in all 8 core design principles, with the largest deficits with CDP 7, authority to self-govern, CDP 1, strong sense of identity and purpose, and CDP 3, decision-making. In other words, many people in their workplaces, they can't do their jobs as they see fit. They don't find much meaning in their work, and they don't take part in the decisions that influence them. And so isn't that interesting that business groups are deficient in all 8? And in general, when you review the sprawling literature on management and business, there is overwhelming evidence for the efficacy of the core design principles once you know what to look for. I have an article that I can provide that's with my associates, Steve Hayes and Paul Atkins, that just reviews this literature. And just, very few people in the management field know about Elinor Ostrom, but still, you can search the literature for each core design principle, not hard. That's key terms. And you'll just find study after study, meta-analysis after meta-analysis demonstrating the efficacy of these principles. So this is a great example of paradigms, basically. There's something about the neoclassical paradigm that causes all this stuff to be invisible. And there's something about the multi-level paradigm that once you bring it to the foreground and you look for evidence, it's lying all around you. It's like you don't even have to do an additional study. And so it's amazing that way. And so here we have it, our two paradigms. And now I wanted to just dwell a little bit on how do we actually accomplish this paradigm shift? How do we move from one to the other? And my first point is to go beyond leadership training. I know that this talk is supposed to be about leadership training, but I think there's something problematic about the very concept of leadership training, where your point of contact with an organization is some leader who, by definition, has power within the organization. Of course, it's good as far as it goes, but it does not address the authoritarian structure of many organizations. And so you might say it's like trying to persuade a dictator to be a benign dictator. And so what's really needed, and leadership training can be the beginning, make no mistake, but what's really needed, I think, if you were going to be serious about implementing those core design principles, it requires changes in the distribution of power. And an amazing example of this is this book, Turn This Ship Around, about how this captain, David Marquet, actually, first of all, understood this and then implemented it in one of the most hierarchical social organizations you could possibly imagine. I mean, just imagine what's needed to cause a nuclear submarine to function well at any time, and especially in battle. And he still speaks eloquently on the need for what he calls a leader-leader model rather than a leader-follower model. And basically, as he would put it, if someone's just following orders, no matter where they are, on a chain of command. If somebody's just following orders, that's just a waste of human resources. So that's an amazing book to read. So what can we do to go beyond just having leaders as our point of entry? What we've done, and it's been proving to be very successful, is to create what we call a multi-level framework for ongoing interaction. So this is kind of a team of teams framework. So individuals, level 1, are members of small teams. Level 2, representing organizations. Level 3, that expect to work with each other. Level 4. And then the hope is for this to be ongoing interactions, for continuous improvement. It's not some fixed period of training, and then after that, they're on their own. Although it can be done for a trial period. And what we find is that if you set this up, and it's not much more difficult to set up than just to work with leaders. When you set it up as a kind of a scaffold, it takes off on its own, even before you add specific training. People just love the opportunity to talk and compare notes and so on. Basically, quite a lot of multi-level cultural evolution takes place spontaneously once you set up the lines of communication. And after you do it for a trial period, you can just put it to the team if you want to continue. And the value proposition has become clear to them by then. And they say, yeah, definitely this is worth our time. Happy to work with you. If you wanted to explore this, then very, very happy to work with you. Another added value is to provide a generalized explanation for best practices. What our study showed is that although there's an average deficit for business groups, there's still variation around that mean, and there's still a high end of the distribution. In other words, there are examples of business groups that do implement the core design principles and function spectacularly as a result. In fact, there's many examples, including legendary examples such as Toyota and their continuous improvement method, which has led to lean, and we get agile. We get if you look at the outstanding corporations profiled by the conscious capitalism movement, and I'm getting to Barry Wehmuller, then what you find is that these are businesses on the high end of that bell curve. They implement the core, they work well, and that's due in part to their implementation of the core design principles. They never heard of Ostrom, but somehow or other they came by it. But that's part of the problem, because what you find is that even though they're making the right moves, their way of describing the right moves tends to be fairly local in terms of their understanding of why it works. And that makes it difficult to diffuse the innovation, basically. And so there's a huge added value in order to describe the common denominators. I like to use the word archipelago of knowledge and practice. So both, inside universities and outside inside and outside the ivory tower, there's a vast archipelago of knowledge and practice, many islands with little communication among islands. And so what that means is there can be something that's spectacularly successful, and it doesn't spread beyond its borders, or it spreads only very slowly. Take Toyota as an example, which is widely known, right? Yeah, except that took 80 years, almost a century, from the inception of those methods to the present. And although it's widely known, it's not widely known enough. And so catalysis is important here. Back to being able to do in years what would otherwise take decades or centuries. And I got to know Raj Sisodia a couple years ago now, and we bonded almost instantly. And so Raj gets the idea that the added value, basically, of providing a scientific basis for the conscious capitalism movement. And we have a podcast on that subject, which is linked there. And so I'm almost done here. Another thing that can be done, I think, low-hanging fruit, is to develop a rubric for evolutionary case case reports. Because case reports, of course, are a staple of business schools, writing up businesses and their practices. And I'm hopeful. I've been talking with Brian and Michael about doing this with Barry Wemuller. I mean, the fact that it succeeded in changing the culture of over 120 other companies, which it doesn't acquire, it adopts in its own vocabulary, is something that's already well known in the business world. Everybody Matters is a great book to read, but it has not been described for what it is, as a replicated experiment in conscious multi-level cultural evolution. And if we did describe it that way, I guarantee you the impact would be huge and would extend far beyond its current audience, inside the business world and outside the business world. So I'm hopeful that we can get that going. And in general, that we can develop a rubric for business case reports, so that whenever anyone learns about and writes up a business, either as students, as a class exercise, or in any other way, that actually we could be gathering this information and having the courtesan principles in mind. In other words, we can extend this paradigm not only in the present and future working with companies, but we could actually extend it into the past, and that there's a huge benefit of doing that. So now here's just a summary of how the new paradigm leads to a new common sense. What basically just becomes common sense from a multi-level paradigm: systemic good must be the explicit target of selection. Conventional understanding of the invisible hand metaphor profoundly untrue. Lower level units and identities remain important, but must be coordinated. Small and appropriately structured groups as fundamental units in social organization. That's something that's almost invisible to the neoclassical paradigm. Governance and change must be participatory at all levels. And we must function in two capacities: as designers of whole systems and as participants in the systems that we design. And there we find actually a legitimate conception of the invisible hand returns within the multi-level paradigm. So after we act as the invisible hand by functioning in the capacity as designers of whole systems, then we can function within that system without having the whole system in mind, as if led by an invisible hand. And so the invisible hand returns in a more legitimate form. And so as we end this article, and the QR code links to this article, the two common denominators for all positive change efforts are the need to cooperate and the need to be adaptable in multiple contexts and multiple scale. Once this is comprehended in all its generality, we can look forward to a surge of effective policies that consciously evolve a world that works for all. And I'll leave that up just for a minute, so if you want to scan that QR code, and then we'll return to the gallery view. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, David. We got about 5 minutes or so left and a couple good questions in the chat. Hopefully they'll continue to come. A lot of them focus around how do we continue to move from this idea of an effectively working team that might have those CDPs involved to this multi-level, more systemic area. And so David was asking, well, is it a false comparison between the classical model and this way to lead a local team? And I think you got to this in some later slides about, well, it really is the multi-level aspect of integrating the system. So anything more that you want to share about that? What's the true counterpoint to the neoclassical model, the neoclassical system?
Yeah, well, I think that I've done quite a bit of thought on this, and I have a print conversation with a specialist on Agile. He's an advisor for the Boston Consulting Group named Laurent Auld. And what the gist of that conversation is that team Agile and other team methods, Lean and Agile and other team methods, they work pretty well at the small scale. And often their problem is that sits underneath the standard hierarchy, and that's where it goes wrong. And so what's needed is for those same principles to be implemented up and down the entire organization, which can be difficult. So I think but there's still plenty of companies that do that. So I think that the principle in accordance with CDP 8 really need to be implemented all up and down the organization, and also that often even at the team level, then something like agile gets kind of fetishized, and also it gets commercialized, and often becomes less effective even at the team level. So there again, if you if you organize your teams according to the core design principles, that's not exactly the same as the various other formulations of it.
Excellent, David. And Christiane just put in the chat, could groups develop appropriate relationships with other groups under the current economic system? And I think it's a, just more general question. Well, can we work within the current system with empowered and thoughtful teams? Or is there a fundamental need to adjust the system, as you said in the previous slide, the invisible hand of the system, plus being a participant in the system?
I talked quite a lot about bottom up meets enlightened top down. So bottom up, a lot can be done bottom up. I mean, a whole lot can be done bottom up. And the more this paradigm spreads and becomes the new common sense, then the more it affects basically, how we vote, and how basically for anyone that shares this paradigm and they have a choice between a company that does the right thing and a company that doesn't do the right thing. And then, of course, then business is going to flow in that direction. The whole customer base can. So this is kind of bottom up power that is great. But enlightened top down is can make it work even faster. One example of that was introduced to me by Raj Sisodia is Microsoft under the leadership of Satya Nadella. So there we have first Bill Gates and then Steve Ballmer, both hard-driving, competitive types, and then Satya Nadella, who is a different person. He's more empathic. He's more holistic. It's nothing he learned in business school. It's in part his Indian heritage, and it's in part his life experience raising a special need child, and so on. Read his book. It's called Hit Refresh. And as CEO of Microsoft, is actually able to implement this top down, both within the organization and the relationship between the organization and other organizations. So, and then at some level, of course, you need legal changes. And even there, I've been told, I don't regard myself as an expert, that the Biden administration is doing great things. And basically focusing on the middle class, and that and Biden has surrounded himself by people that are very much thinking this way, and we should be giving him a little more cred, a lot more cred, actually. So it's a case where once you adopt the paradigm, I mean, what I just said about a new common sense, it's true. And then that could work up and down the scale. So there's something that everybody can do, I think. And I think that's very optimistic. Something everyone can do. And also for everyone, there will be obstacles that are not going to change in the near future. And that's where flexibility is needed. That's where and we use acceptance and commitment therapy and training, if you know that, which is really good at helping you, whether an individual or a group, realize what's on the left side of the matrix, if you know that jargon, and accept that it exists and commit to working around it. So that means that there's something that everyone can do as individuals all the way up in all the groups of their lives, because as I've just said, this flows from business to every other kind of group, group. That's how general it is.
Well, David, I think that's a beautiful place to conclude. And I know we could continue this conversation for a long time, but we're at our time. There is something that everyone can do along the way. And if I'd ask everybody that participated, go back through the chat, utilize the QR code that David utilized. There were a number of other links that we put in there. If everybody would take even just 5 minutes later today to follow up on something that you heard, dive deeper into the research that was referenced, a lot of the book references and different things. That's how we can continue to take small steps forward. I'm so thankful for David Sloan Wilson for joining us today, for Michael Pearson for kicking us off. We will have another session next week. Sign up for that. Encourage others to join as well. And as always, go out to the Humanistic Leadership Academy website to look for additional cohorts, a different chance to connect, and more resources along the way. David, thank you so much for joining us today and kicking off our webinar series.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone. That'll be our conclusion today. We will share the recording as soon as we get the IT to process, and we thank everyone for joining today. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.